As we know, tourism is vulnerable to climate change. The physical impacts of climate change will manifest through the degradation of natural assets and also through changing consumer and climatic conditions which impact on visitor comfort levels. The Australian tourism industry's vulnerability is high in key natural destinations, including Kakadu National Park, the Great Barrier Reef, the wet tropics of Queensland and Australia's alpine regions. However, it's the indirect impacts through changes in consumer behaviour and new policy settings to address climate change that represent a more immediate risk to the industry. As such, it's critical for policymakers and industry to play an active role in informing policy responses and educating public perceptions. As we heard through the conference so far, tourism plays a very important role in national economies. But the role of tourism is actually greater than the sum of its economic components. For many destinations, tourism is highly dependent on the natural environment. The tourism industry recognises this and can play a significant role in environmental protection and preservation. The presentation from Andrew Skeet this morning on the Great Barrier Reef was a prime example of cooperation between the industry and government to develop outcomes for the tourism industry and also preserve the natural environment. Tourism also provides a vehicle for sharing knowledge and culture and building relationships between nations. Importantly, it provides an opportunity for Indigenous people to preserve their culture and way of life. It is the economic value of tourism that enables environmental and social development objectives to be met. However, the industry recognises that more needs to be done, not only improving the environmental performance of the industry, but also ensuring that policy responses recognise the wider contribution of the industry through social development, environmental protection and conservation. I think the key message here really is that if the economic value of tourism is undercut, its capacity to achieve environmental and social development objectives is also reduced. The vulnerability of tourism to the impacts of climate change provides it with an imperative to act positively to contribute to the mitigation efforts and develop adaptation strategies. As outlined in the paper, I'd like to suggest the following principles to help guide the tourism industry and policymakers to respond to climate change. Firstly, tourism recognises that it affects the natural environment and contributes to and is affected by climate change. The industry, with the support of policymakers, must accurately define its contribution to climate change as the basis for informing policy responses. Policy responses must be comprehensive in coverage, focused on least cost measures and be commensurate with the industry's contribution to climate change. These policy responses must acknowledge the wider social, economic and environmental benefits of tourism. There must be action. Government and industry need to mitigate the impacts of climate change. This should be informed by contributions from industry and be supported by policies that provide the appropriate market signals for investment by the industry. And finally, adaptation strategies must be developed to deal with the built-in impacts of climate change. In April this year, the Council of Australian Governments endorsed the National Climate Change Adaptation Framework, which includes possible actions to assist the most vulnerable sectors and regions to adapt to the impacts of climate change. As part of this framework, the Australian Tourism Ministers' Council agreed to develop a Tourism Action Plan on climate change. The development of the action plan is being guided by a task force comprising officials from national, state and territory tourism agencies, the Australian Greenhouse Office, the tourism industry, and also an observer from the New Zealand Ministry of Tourism. The scope of the work of the task force includes quantifying the tourism industry carbon footprint, researching consumer attitudes towards climate change issues, examining localised climate change impacts on tourism regions, identifying strategies to increase the industry's resilience and ability to adapt to physical climate change impacts, assessing the applicability and credibility of a range of benchmarking, accreditation and carbon offset schemes, and developing communication strategies targeting tourism industry and the domestic and international market. In closing, I'd like to reiterate that the tourism industry and policymakers need to focus on policies and actions that are based on rigorous analysis of the tourism industry's contribution to climate change, acknowledge the economic, social and environmental benefits of tourism, and in combination with all industry sectors will achieve mitigation and adaptation objectives to at least cost to individual economies and the global economy as a whole. Thank you.